Tonight I want to talk with you about this tragedy, the broader threat of terrorism, and how we can keep our country safe. The FBI is still gathering the facts about what happened in San Bernardino, but here's what we know. The victims were brutally murdered and injured by one of their co-workers and his wife. So far, we have no evidence that the killers were directed by a terrorist organization overseas or that they were part of a broader conspiracy here at home. But it is clear that the two of them had gone down the dark path of radicalization, embracing a perverted interpretation of Islam that calls for war against America and the West. They had stockpiled assault weapons, ammunition, and pipe bombs. So this was an act of terrorism designed to kill innocent people.
All right, so the president talking baby talk to most of us and not advancing any strategy or any tactics or any plans to actually take out ISIS. He did, for the first time in his presidency, do a couple of right things. Okay. Days after his FBI director had done so, that the attack in San Bernardino was an act of terrorism. Yeah, he should have given that speech a week ago. He said our nation has been at war with terrorists since 9/11. Well, he admitted finally that the mass killing at Fort Hood was, in fact, a terrorist attack, as Major Hassan was chanting and screaming Allahu Akbar. That was a pretty good indication. And Obama said at long last that an extremist ideology has spread within some Muslim communities. Now, this was an encouragement to some people, a sign, if you will, that perhaps maybe the president gets it. But this is all nonsense, because the speech last night may have had a few right thoughts, but the reality is the president used false and misleading words, as I described earlier. In other words, they don't reflect any fundamental shift or change in the president's thinking. Now, the president's speech last night was political, defensive in nature only. He came up with no problem solving for what is now a bigger and more clear and present danger to every American. He's facing a political problem, and he's tried to stop the political problem. So he threw in a few words here and there to give the appearance that he gets it. But, you know, his whole presidency has been involved in the distortion of words, including making claims that we know to be lies. Like, if you want to keep your plan, keep your plan, keep your doctor, and you're going to pay on average $2,500 less a year. So the words last night, I think, are window dressing, misleading, fiction, BS, if you will. And if the choice is between believing what Obama said last night versus the previous 7 years of his presidency, and last week his statement that the weather is a far bigger national security threat than anything else, then, you know, go where your heart leads you. But there's a problem, because we have a lot of people in this country that can't believe we are at war with radical Islamists and that this was an act of terrorism. Now, for example, Pate wrote a piece before the FBI classified the attacks as terrorism. In my opinion, the fact that we can't determine whether San Bernardino is terrorism means that it's not terrorism, regardless of what the shooters may have intended or what their nationality may be. On the other hand, in my opinion, Colorado Springs is definitely terrorism under the law. The crime appears to be intended to intimidate a certain group of people and to influence government policies. Anyway, joining us, Pate, trial attorney, 20 years experience in criminal defense, and constitutional attorney, Jay Sekulow, the chief counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice. So, Paige, will you admit that you were wrong?
I'll certainly admit that more information has become available since I wrote that piece. However, I'm not wrong about the legal analysis. It is not so much the race, nationality, or faith of the person committing the crime, but the apparent intention for the crime that defines terrorism under the law.
Well, if you want to look under the law, there are several definitions of terrorism in the U.S. Code, specifically 18 U.S.C. 2331, which defines international terrorism as activities involve violent acts dangerous to human beings that violate federal or state law, appear to be intended to intimidate, coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, and to affect the conduct of the government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and occurs primarily outside the territorial jurisdiction of the U.S. So I think in 3 of those definitions, it's dead on accurate.
Well, I think now we know a lot more about the intention of these individuals in San Bernardino.
So you were wrong in your article when you said that because we can't determine if it's terrorism means it's not. You're wrong about that.
I don't think we should have to guess about terrorism. I mean,
but we're not guessing anymore.
You did. You said it wasn't terrorism. You said
it wasn't clear that it was
and now we
terrorism.
know, based on evidence that's come out subsequently, but we knew at the time of the attack that if you look at the statute that Sean mentioned, 2331, 18 U.S.C. 2331, that the elements that the Department of Justice reviews in determining whether something is an act of domestic terrorism was clearly met, because within 24 hours, the Department of Justice took over the investigation. That means the Joint Terrorism Task Force is involved, and the FBI leads the investigation. And this knee-jerk reaction of always trying to not make it terrorism, when it's so obvious that it is terrorism, where you had one major network wouldn't even release the name of the terrorist, which was already out all over the country, but they didn't want to say the name because they thought somehow by saying the name that would be impugning people. When the reality is, Sean, this is what gets us into trouble. Is this? The neighbor said they were afraid to say anything. It was unusual. There were a lot of people of Middle Eastern descent coming in and out of their house. That in of itself, was that problematic? I don't know. But how about all of the weaponry they found inside? How about if you thought something was wrong, you're afraid to say it because you're worried about being accused of profiling, as if that's a crime for an individual citizen, which, by the way, it's not.
But it's not just
but the reality is,
you're creating
going all the way out of the way to say it's not terrorism makes us look weaker. That's the problem. The knee-jerk reaction, we don't want it to be terrorist. Listen, the president did that speech, Sean, you're absolutely right, not because he wanted to, because he had to. And people are celebrating that the president said the word terrorist as if that's an accomplishment. The bar's that low that becomes a victory. And he needs to stop calling them ISIL, too. Never define your enemy by their aspirations for the Levant.
Paige, what's your reaction?
Well, if this is terrorism, then it's certainly a different kind of terrorism than we've been fighting.
No, it's not
connected to. It was ISIS inspired, but it wasn't ISIS directed or controlled, and I think that's different, and it's a significant difference in how we need to.
Well, we don't. First of all, we don't know all the facts about that yet. Number one, and number two, it's a problem if ISIS. This is a new tactic, a new strategy, where you have sympathizers that you don't know who they are. They're all over the world. And that they're getting information and getting inspired. Remember, we do know that this guy was in touch with radical Islamists in Pakistan, as was she. So they were in touch with radical Islamists. So for you to just suggest that this was not inspired by them is insane.
Well, if you look at what they did not call for any particular action. They didn't say we're here on behalf of ISIS.
You don't know what happened when they were meeting in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia?
No, I'm talking about the actual incident.
But you don't know. You don't. But we do know that they were in touch with people that were radicalized, people recognized as international terrorists. So, what do you think those conversations were about? You know, how to model some clay. I mean, what are you talking about?
Well, whatever those conversations were, it doesn't make their intent any more.
It doesn't. So, what do you think? What do you think radical Islamists were saying to them?
Well, I think in every other incident where we've clearly been able to identify it as terrorism, it's been clear.
Well, you want to live with your head in the sand. That's what it sounds like to me, Jay. It sounds like a lot like the president.
Because the president refuses, although he said we're entered into a new phase of the war on terror. He never defined what that phase is. But here's the reality. ISIS, in and of itself, and this is what people, I've studied ISIS since the beginning. ISIS is motivated by not just command and control, but also by inspiration. For instance, you can inspire an act of terror. It's still an act of terror. The fact that there was not a command and control out of Syria or Iraq is irrelevant, both to the law and to the fact that this is a tactic of ISIS. ISIS says they are encouraging this kind of activity. So the fact that there is communication with known terrorists, the fact that his father has said that the son and other family members have said it wanted to see the destruction of Israel, that the statement coming out at the time of the attack from the wife, Malika, that she in fact posted that she pledged her allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, well, that's all evidence of terrorists and ISIS inspired. So what difference does it make to the people who were killed in San Bernardino and injured, whether it was ISIS controlled or ISIS inspired? It makes no difference. It's terrorism. And we have to start operating under the fact that they have successfully, and this is horrible to say, successfully infiltrated, which is exactly what they wanted to do, American population base. And, you can close down the fiancé waivers and all of this. That's great. But we need to come to the new reality. And the president failed to hit that. But to shy away from saying these are acts of terror are ridiculous.
Let me ask.
Well, I think you need to take time to investigate these matters, and instead of jumping to the conclusion that it's terrorism because of the type of people who were involved in the crime. You do that, you're going to create this culture of fear, and we're going to go off in the wrong direction. And I think that's a huge mistake because we want to make sure that people who are truly committing terrorist acts are investigated and prosecuted, but we do it in a methodical way, not a knee-jerk reaction.
Let me give you some crime stats. Did you know from the FBI? Remember, Eric Holder clone Loretta Lynch said last week that in the wake of the attacks in Paris and San Bernardino, her number one top priority was to make sure that Muslims don't become the targets of a hate crime backlash. Well, I'm pleased to inform the Attorney General that she has almost nothing to worry about in regard to this because, according to her own FBI, 14 years after the 9/11 attacks, Muslims are almost never the target of hate crimes in America. In fact, the number of hate crimes against Muslims is so small, dwarfed by the number of hate crimes perpetrated against Jewish Americans, which, by the way, begs the question that if hate crimes against Jews are so much more common than hate crimes against Muslims, why isn't the Attorney General making the prevention of hate crimes against Jews her top priority? Because 62%, 62.4 to be exact, percent are victims of hate crimes based on an offender's anti-Jewish bias. Only 11.6% of victims were victimized because of their anti-Islamic bias. Now, I don't want any of these hate crimes taking place, but we could see, Jay, the disproportionate number of Jewish Americans that are attacked.
And nobody wants to view that exactly what it is, which is an act of terrorism. So I think, or they'll say it is. But the reality is, and I think, Sean, you hit it right. If you look at the statistics and you look at the situation that we're engaged in right now, we need to come to a clear understanding of what, in fact, we're actually dealing with here. And what we're dealing with is, when you look at the statistics, to take isolated events is a mistake. To look at overall scope and approach is where the focus should be, which is, I believe, what the FBI is doing. And I think that has to happen. But the reality is, sure, to do these narrow scopes and this knee-jerk reaction of we don't want to call it terrorism too soon, it was obvious to everybody. I'm Page to the exclusion, and Page is a good lawyer. I don't understand why he was so resistant on this. It was obvious to everybody what this is. It took the Department of Justice 24 hours.
We don't even need to go any further than this. The guy Farouk's father. I mean, the father said my son shared the ideology of al-Baghdadi's ideology and supported the creation of the Islamic State. He was also obsessed with Israel. I told him he had to stay calm and patient because in 2 years Israel will not exist anymore. So we know he was radicalized. We know he was in touch with radicals, but people like Page want to live in denial. And I'm not really sure what your motivation is here, Page. If I had an hour or so, I could probably get to the bottom of it, but I don't have that much time.
Well, my motivation was to focus on the law and try to bring us all back to a rational discussion when people are.
Well, it is a rational discussion. The father says he was radicalized. Okay, so then I get back to my original question. You were wrong, and you won't admit you were wrong.
No, I was not wrong about the fact that when I looked at the issue initially, it did not appear to be terrorism because none of the elements of that law had been met. We could not tell.
No, you're one of these people that wants to race. You want to race to the fact that it's not terrorism when all indications were that it was.
Understand that you can be a terrorist and commit a crime that's not terrorism. It has to be the crime itself.
You can be a terrorist. Hang on. You could be a terrorist, and I guess
yes,
and not break a law that's related to terrorism. I guess you can get caught speeding. Sure,
of course.
But if you go into a room, if you go into a room and you shoot people, and we find out that your radical ideology and your indoctrination and your friendships are all people that are terrorists, that's a pretty good indication you were acting on your radicalism, isn't it?
I agree. It's certainly good evidence that was the motivation.
Certainly good evidence.
That's not what's required under the statute. You have to look at the crime and not the person that committed the crime. Was the crime committed with the apparent intention to intimidate a group of people or to influence government policy?
All of the above. All right.
Well, I think now we know a lot more than we did when it happened, or even 24 hours
so you were wrong.
after.
So you jumped the gun, and you're part of a group of people that wants to live in denial that terrorism is existing in this country, and that's a problem. Hey, I got to run. Thank you both for being with us.